The Japanese fortifications no longer resembled anything that could be called defenses. What had once been carefully constructed out of reinforced concrete and steel, painstakingly carved into the coral and volcanic rock of Iwo Jima over the course of months, was now reduced to little more than shattered wreckage. The bunkers that had stood firm against storms and air raids were nothing but twisted iron and burning pits in the earth. From the bridge of the battleship Iowa, I raised my binoculars and stared across the water. Our massive 16-inch naval rifles were speaking with terrible authority, and each shell, a steel giant weighing as much as an automobile, reshaped the island in ways no man could have imagined. Where the Japanese had once built solid structures, there were now craters that looked as though meteors had struck, gouging deep scars into the volcanic terrain until it resembled the barren, lifeless surface of another world. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison. I served as gunnery officer aboard the Iowa during the naval bombardment that preceded the Marine landings in February 1945. I had seen war before, but what unfolded during those 3 relentless days of shelling was unlike anything I had ever known, and the memory of it has never left me. It was the most destructive, calculated use of naval artillery ever unleashed, and I was there on the front line, close enough to feel the shockwaves, close enough to watch American steel rain down on Japanese strongholds with a precision that felt impossible for weapons of such size and power. The morning of February 16th broke with a cold, colorless sky. The Pacific stretched out in all directions, gray and endless, and the air carried the kind of chill that cut through a man's uniform. All around us, battleships and cruisers loomed, forming the most powerful concentration of naval gunfire ever gathered for a single task. To port and starboard were the great ships of our fleet, Missouri and Wisconsin, the mighty sisters of the Iowa, and beyond them, the seasoned veterans of earlier wars, Nevada, Tennessee, Arkansas, New York, and Texas. Together, this steel, armada had been assembled to hammer a target no larger than 8 square miles, a piece of volcanic rock that the Japanese had transformed into a fortress, bristling with guns. Reports from intelligence painted a grim picture. 22,000 enemy soldiers concealed in tunnels, caves, and reinforced bunkers, all linked like veins beneath the island's surface. They were waiting for us, prepared to die rather than surrender. Our orders came directly from Admiral Raymond Spruance himself. We were to weaken those defenses so that the Marines would have a chance when they stormed the beaches. He had not needed to add the obvious, that every emplacement we destroyed meant fewer American lives lost in the days to come. Every bunker collapsed, every gun emplacement silenced, every cave sealed by high explosives was a step toward bringing our boys home alive. I stood at my station on the Iowa's bridge at 6:30, watching the blackness of night retreat before the pale light of dawn. Captain John McCrae was leaning over the chart table with his navigation officers, reviewing, once more, the carefully prepared fire plan. Around us, the ship was alive with anticipation. The mingled odors of diesel, coffee, and salt hung in the air as 2,700 sailors prepared themselves for what was to come. It was a moment suspended between routine and history, as if the whole ship understood that the hours ahead would be remembered, long after the guns fell silent. "Morrison," the captain called, his voice sharp. "Status of turret number 2? I consulted my clipboard before answering. "Fully operational, sir. All 3 rifles loaded with armor-piercing rounds. Target range is 18,000 yards. He gave a curt nod of approval, and below our feet, the giant turret began its slow, deliberate turn toward the enemy shore. Each of our 3 main turrets housed 3 colossal rifles, the largest naval guns ever mounted on an American warship. When all 9 fired together, the power of the recoil was so immense that it physically shoved the 45,000-ton battleship sideways in the water, as if the sea itself could not contain the fury of their discharge. At precisely 0700 hours, the signal came from the flag bridge, "Commence firing." In that instant, the world itself seemed to tear apart. The forward turret roared with a force that rattled the bones of every man aboard. The blast wave swept down through the decks, shattering coffee cups in the mess and rattling bolts in the bulkheads. From each barrel leapt a tongue of orange fire, followed by thunderous clouds of smoke that momentarily obscured our view of the distant island. I did not need to see the results to understand the destruction being wrought. Each of those enormous shells, 6 feet in length and nearly 3,000 pounds apiece, screamed toward Iwo Jima at speeds exceeding 2,000 feet per second, and when they landed 25 seconds later, the island convulsed. Through the lenses of my binoculars, I watched in grim silence as geysers of smoke, earth, and shattered concrete burst skyward from the northern beaches. The sound of the detonations rolled back across the sea like a continuous peal of thunder. Orders came swiftly through my headset. Concentrate on the concrete bunkers on the northern slope, adjust range to 18,500 yards. I relayed the coordinates, and the crew of Turret 2 responded with machine-like efficiency. Loading a shell of that size required 8 men working in perfect unison, guided by a hydraulic rammer that shoved the steel behemoth into place. "Turret 2 ready to fire," came the report. "Execute," I answered, and seconds later, another trio of shells thundered out. I raised my binoculars again and saw a Japanese stronghold on the ridge vanish before my eyes, replaced in an instant by a crater 40 feet across. Slabs of concrete the size of trucks were flung into the air as though they were toys, and we were just beginning. Off our starboard beam, the Missouri opened up with her 9 great rifles, adding her fury to the bombardment. Moments later, the Wisconsin joined in, and soon the older battleships were pouring in fire from their 14-inch guns. The combined barrage was beyond imagination. Every 15 seconds, the island was struck by dozens of shells, each one weighing more than a ton and slamming down with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. My assistant, Lieutenant Bobby Chen, stood beside me with a stopwatch and notebook, recording the rate of fire with meticulous precision despite the chaos. "Sir, 36 rounds from the main battery in the first 8 minutes, he shouted, his voice nearly drowned by the thunder of the guns. "Keep tracking every shot," I told him firmly. "The Marines will want to know exactly what was destroyed." The bombardment did not slow. High above, our spotting planes circled the island, their pilots calling down corrections and marking new targets. "Iowa, this is Spotter 1, came a voice through the static of the radio. "Enemy battery in the rocks at grid 2740. Request fire mission." I snatched the handset. "Spotter 1, this is Iowa Fire Control. Target acquired. Stand by." Within minutes, Turret 2 and her sisters were pounding the coordinates, and moments later the pilot's voice crackled back, triumphant. "Direct. Hit. Battery destroyed. Outstanding shooting, Iowa." As the hours stretched on, the island itself seemed to change shape under the rain of steel. Hillsides collapsed, tunnels caved in, and ground that had been carefully fortified for months was leveled in minutes. The Japanese had prepared their defenses to withstand anything they thought possible, but they had not prepared for the fury of 16-inch naval rifles. During a rare pause in the firing, Seaman First Class Danny Rodriguez from Turret 2 climbed up to the bridge. His face was smeared with powder residue, and sweat soaked his uniform despite the February chill. Breathing heavily, he addressed me. "Sir, the boys down in the turret are wondering, how many rounds have we fired so far?" I consulted the logbook. Turret 2 has fired 42. The ship as a whole has unleashed more than 130. Rodriguez let out a long whistle and shook his head slowly, the enormity of the destruction settling over him as it had over all of us. "Each of those shells cost more than my father earned in 5 years, Rodriguez muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I just hope they're making a difference." I gestured toward the smoldering island. "Take a good look through those binoculars, son, and tell me if you think they're working." He lifted the glass and studied what Only hours earlier had been a fortress of bunkers, trenches, and carefully positioned artillery. Now it was nothing but jagged craters, broken concrete, and fires rising in greasy columns of smoke. Even from nearly 10 miles away, we could see that the island's once formidable defenses were being ripped apart methodically. "Good Lord," he whispered, lowering the binoculars. "It looks like someone took a hammer the size of a battleship and smashed it flat." He wasn't wrong. That was precisely what our fleet was doing. The Iowa-class battleships were built to be the bludgeons of the Pacific, and we were using them exactly as intended, pounding the island into submission. By midday, we had been firing without pause for 5 straight hours. The heat from the guns was so intense that the barrels glowed dull red, forcing us to halt occasionally just to keep them from warping. During one of these pauses, Captain McCrae called the senior officers to the bridge. "Gentlemen," he began, his tone steady, but grim, "we've already expended more than 200 16-inch shells this morning alone. That is more firepower than was unleashed in some entire battles of the last war. And yet our intelligence insists the Japanese still have plenty of fight left in them." He tapped an aerial photograph laid out across the chart table. "They've hollowed out this island with a web of tunnels. Many of their heavy guns are mounted on tracks, allowing them to shift positions faster than we can adjust. Unless we keep hammering, they'll still be able to meet the Marines with deadly resistance. When the landings begin," Lieutenant Commander Tom Williams, our communications officer, added his report. "Captain, word from the rest of the line. Missouri has already fired over 180 rounds. Wisconsin is close behind, and the older ships, Nevada, and the others, have sent over 400 shells ashore. Altogether, the fleet has poured more than 1,500 heavy shells into Iwo Jima." McCrae nodded once, his jaw tight. "Then we'll pour in 1,500 more if that's what it takes. No Japanese gun is going to be left standing." The afternoon session was even fiercer than the morning. Now we had clearer priorities. Hardened command posts, ammunition stores, and artillery that had exposed itself by firing back. The defenders were stubborn, and despite the punishment they had endured, several of their batteries still had teeth. Not long after lunch, as I adjusted the elevation on turret 3, I heard the shriek of incoming fire. A second later, a massive column of seawater erupted only a few hundred yards off our port side, spraying the deck like a storm. "Enemy shore battery has our range," a voice shouted over the intercom. The shell had missed, but only barely. A direct hit could have gutted us. Captain McCrae didn't flinch. "All guns, bring fire onto that position at once. Let's show them what American battleships can do." Within minutes, every one of our 9 16-inch rifles was locked, on target. The full broadside thundered out, 9 Titanic shells arcing toward the coast. When they struck, the impact was so violent the entire ridge vanished beneath a plume of smoke and debris. When the haze cleared, there was nothing left of the Japanese battery, just a smoking crater gouged deep into the volcanic rock. It never fired again. Hour after hour, the process repeated. Targets were identified, marked, and obliterated with mechanical efficiency. Spotter planes flying high above the island radioed in reports of devastation that seemed impossible. Entire stretches of defensive works had ceased to exist. Ammunition stores went up in spectacular eruptions that sent fireballs hundreds of feet into the air, visible from miles away. Bunkers that had taken months of labor to build crumbled in seconds under the force of our shells. Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan, a hardened veteran of 18 years in the Navy and long service in the Atlantic, came to stand beside me as another massive explosion tore across the island. He shook his head slowly, disbelief plain in his eyes. "Mr. Morrison, I've been serving since 1927. I fought U-boats, crossed the Atlantic under fire. But I've never seen anything like this. We aren't just bombarding that island. We're erasing it." He was right. The combined guns of 8 battleships were altering the geography itself. Hills collapsed into valleys, cliffs were pulverized, and the northern beaches, the very ground the Marines would storm in 3 days, were transformed into a wasteland of rubble and smoke. Yet the most remarkable thing was not simply the power, but the accuracy. From more than 10 miles away, our fire control systems were putting shells onto precise coordinates. Machines that had been experimental only a decade earlier now allowed us to guide massive artillery with pinpoint precision. I watched as Lieutenant Paul Anderson, barely 22 and fresh out of Annapolis, hunched over the fire control computers. His fingers spun the dials with the calm assurance of a man twice his age. "Sir," he called, "solution ready on that observation post East Ridge. Range 19,250 yards, bearing 047. "Send it to Turret 1, I ordered. 3 shells thundered out. Through my binoculars, I saw them bracket the target perfectly, and when the smoke cleared, the Japanese position was gone. "Outstanding, Anderson," I told him. "Right on target." The young officer beamed. "Thank you, sir. These new Mark 8 systems are incredible. We can hit a 50-yard circle from 20,000 yards. And he was right. The Iowa-class battleships represented the peak of naval warfare. Their 16-inch rifles could hurl shells nearly 24 miles with frightening accuracy. Armor-piercing rounds could smash through 30 feet of reinforced concrete. High-explosive rounds left craters large enough to swallow entire buildings. As the sun sank and we were ordered to cease fire for the night, I climbed to the director's station and looked once more through the heavy optics. The island was unrecognizable. Where in the morning there had been a fortress, there was now a wasteland beyond description. Smoke hung in the air, rising from shattered earth. "My God," I whispered under my breath. "What have we done?" But even as I asked it, I knew. What we had done was necessary. Every bunker eliminated, every artillery piece destroyed. Every trench buried meant more Marines would have a chance to make it through the coming assault alive. Dawn on February 17th brought no respite. Before the sky had fully brightened, the order came to resume bombardment. This time, our aim was even more focused. Night reconnaissance flights had charted surviving positions, and we were ready to finish them. The Japanese had tried in vain to repair their defenses under cover of darkness, but as soon as daylight revealed them, our guns opened up again. I stood next to Captain McCrae as the first message of the day crackled in from above. "Iowa, this is Air Spot 1. Enemy has shifted several heavy pieces to the western slope. Request immediate fire mission." "You heard him, Morrison," McCrae said. "Let's knock them out before they can do damage." The order went through the fire control channels, and minutes later, 6 shells from our main battery obliterated the new position completely. Another Japanese gun line silenced, another threat removed before the Marines ever set foot on those black sands. The rhythm became almost routine: locate, fire, destroy. All day long we pounded the island. The Missouri unleashed more than 200 shells of her own that day, and the older ships rained down hundreds more. Yet it was the Iowa-class ships that carried the burden. Each shell was an avalanche in steel, each broadside the equal of an entire division's fire in the last war. By the middle of the second day, the island shook beneath a ceaseless rain of destruction. And then, unexpectedly, we received a visitor. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded the amphibious forces set to land on Iwo Jima, arrived on our ship by helicopter to watch the bombardment with his own eyes. I had the honor of briefing him personally, showing him a detailed chart of the island. I explained that we had systematically targeted and neutralized more than 60% of the identified Japanese defenses. The concrete bunkers had been shattered, tunnel entrances buried, and at least a dozen artillery batteries wiped out. He studied the map closely before asking about the cave systems. I told him our armor-piercing shells could drive deep into the rock, and that we had focused on hitting the entrances, making the underground movement of men and supplies far more difficult. He gave a satisfied nod and remarked that the Marines would be thankful for what we had managed. As if to underline his words, Iowa's massive guns thundered again, and through the windows we watched explosions rip across the island, sending columns of smoke and debris into the air. Turner quietly reminded us that every shell fired meant fewer Marines lost on the beaches. The third day of bombardment was the heaviest yet. By then, we had pinpointed nearly all of the remaining Japanese positions and were determined to wipe them out. At exactly Iwo 700, 8 battleships opened fire together, more than 50 heavy guns unleashing a rolling wall of thunder that seemed to shake the sea itself. Through my binoculars, I saw the rain of steel descend, entire portions of the island, vanishing beneath smoke and fire. What had once been an imposing fortress now looked like a broken wasteland. Lieutenant Chen reported that in just 3 days, Iowa alone had fired more than 400 16-inch shells, with Missouri and Wisconsin expending similar amounts. Across the group, over 3,000 heavy rounds had been delivered, each weighing between 1,400 and 2,700 pounds. Altogether, more than 8,000 tons of steel and explosives had been thrown at the island, a figure heavier than the displacement of many destroyers. What struck me most was not the scale, but the accuracy. Our guns were striking from 18 miles away and landing within yards of the intended targets, a level of precision that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. As the final day of shelling wound down, I thought about the Japanese, soldiers enduring 3 relentless days under fire. 22,000 men had been dug in at the start. How many had survived? How many guns were still able to fire? How many defenses had endured the storm? The answer, we would soon learn, was very few. The supposedly impenetrable fortress was in ruins, battered beyond recognition by the sheer power of America's 16-inch naval rifles. At 1800 on February 18th, Iowa's 9 main guns fired one last devastating salvo, nearly 8 tons of steel and high explosive smashing into the battered strongholds. When the echoes faded and the smoke drifted, a haunting silence spread over the Pacific. Captain McCrae approached me as I secured my equipment. He noted that in only 3 days, we had fired more ammunition than some battleships expended throughout the entire war. He asked me what I thought we had achieved. Looking out at the ruined island barely visible in the evening haze, I replied that where once a fortress had stood bristling with guns, there was now nothing but wreckage and smoking craters. I told him it proved the reach of American naval power. He gave a grave nod, saying he hoped the Marines would see it the same way once they landed. On February 19th, 30,000 Marines stormed Iwo Jima's beaches. Instead of intact bunkers and lethal batteries, they encountered fields of craters and silenced guns. The towering concrete defenses that should have made the landings impossible had been obliterated. The artillery that was expected to shred the assault craft had been destroyed. The observation posts that could have directed deadly fire had vanished. Though the Marines still faced bitter resistance from defenders who survived in the caves and tunnels, the naval bombardment had fulfilled its role. The enemy stronghold had been systematically dismantled, giving the Marines a chance to seize ground that otherwise might have cost thousands more lives. From our position several miles offshore, Iowa stood ready to provide support. As I watched the landing craft close in, I thought about the precision with which our guns had paved the way. In just 3 days, the Iowa-class battleships had shown themselves to be the most effective siege weapons ever built, accomplishing in days what might otherwise have taken months of ground combat. A fortress had been transformed into ruins, and countless American lives had been spared. Yet watching the Marines push inland under fire from what remained of the defenses, I was reminded that overwhelming naval power could not make the fight easy. Victory still required sacrifice. Standing on the bridge as the battle began, I felt both pride in the devastating accuracy of our gunnery and humility at the courage it would take for those men to finish what we had started. In later years, whenever I was asked about the war, I always remembered those 3 days when the battleships reduced Iwo Jima from a fortress to rubble. I would speak of the staggering power of 16-inch naval rifles, the near-surgical precision of American fire, and the systematic crushing of Japanese defenses. Most vividly, I remembered the realization that those bunkers were no longer bunkers at all. They were craters. The Iowa-class battleships had engraved their place in history, with shells heavier than automobiles and faster than the speed of sound. We had proven to the world that American steel, when shaped into weapons of such precision and power, could overcome any fortification. Japan had built a stronghold, and in 3 days we had reduced it to nothing but wreckage. That was the measure of America's naval supremacy in the Pacific, a lesson that would echo for generations. When the final count was made, over 3,000 rounds of heavy ammunition had been fired, more destructive power than many entire battles of earlier wars. Analysts estimated that the Japanese ability to resist the landings had been reduced by 70%. Yet the greatest achievement was not the sheer destruction, but the demonstration of accuracy at unprecedented distances. The Iowa-class ships had shown they could hit with deadly precision from ranges once thought impossible. Watching from the deck as the Marines disappeared into the smoke of combat, I knew I had witnessed something historic. The era of the battleship was nearing its end, soon to be overshadowed by carriers, but for those 3 days in February 1945, the big guns had left their mark. The bunkers were not bunkers anymore. They were monuments to the reach of American naval power, carved into the island with steel and explosives. Every Marine who stepped onto those beaches owed part of his survival to those 16-inch guns that had cleared the way. That was our triumph, our legacy, and the lasting proof of what naval firepower could accomplish when unleashed against even the strongest fortress. Looking back, those 3 days of relentless naval firepower reshaped the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese defenders had built what they believed was an unbreakable fortress, yet American steel and precision reduced it to rubble in less than a week. The bombardment paved the way for the Marines, sparing countless lives that would have been lost if the defenses had remained intact. And yet, even after such overwhelming fire, the island demanded a terrible price in blood before it was finally taken. That balance between the power of machines and the courage of men is what defined the battle for Iwo Jima. In the end, the guns of the battleships could prepare the ground, but only human bravery could claim it. The echoes of those salvos remind us not just of American naval supremacy, but of the extraordinary sacrifice required to